Hi, my name is Dr. Asia Eaton. I'm a psychological scientist and public psychologist, and this is Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. In this podcast, we invite human rights defenders to teach and learn from brain and behavioral scientists about how we can all use science to do human rights work that is more efficient and impactful.
Hello, it is March 3rd, 2026, and today we are talking about sex trafficking education and prevention with Andrea Powell and Dr. Kalyani Gopal. Andrea Powell is a human rights advocate, social entrepreneur, and author with over 20 years of experience blending direct service and advocacy alongside survivors of human trafficking, image-based sexual abuse, and sexual assault. As the co-founder of organizations including Fair Girls, Karana Rising, and the June Coalition, she builds survivor-led systems that integrate trauma-informed care with federal, legislative, and global policy. Her award-winning memoir, Believe Me, offers a visceral look at the systemic failures of the justice system and serves as a foundational text for her work in creating more healing and justice for survivors. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Then we have Dr. Gopal, who is the current president of the Psychology Coalition at the United Nations. She is a distinguished clinical psychologist with over 3 decades of experience in addressing complex issues such as child sexual abuse, human trafficking, and labor trafficking. She is the founder of Safe Coalition for Human Rights, an initiative dedicated to supporting trauma patients and victims globally. Dr. Gopal is the first woman of color and Asian American to serve as president of the Illinois Psychological Association and Division 12 of the American Psychological Association. Her work has garnered international recognition, and she's developed clinical treatment manuals for psychologists in Mongolia, treated grieving families in Myanmar, and created tools for identifying trafficking victims in Ukraine. Dr. Gopal is currently working on establishing Safe Trauma Center in India, as well as upscaling her Safe House shelter to a 40-bed unique residential restorative model for victims of human trafficking and sexual assault. Welcome, Dr. Gopal.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us here.
We'll start with Andrea. If you wanted to just tell us a little bit about how you got involved in work on sex trafficking education and prevention.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's funny, my own revelations of what that answer is has evolved over time. From a super small Texas town, not even really a town. It was just the woods. We had one neighbor. So very kind of sheltered in my own way, but it was near getting close to the Texas border. There was a lot of labor exploitation, a lot of poverty, a lot of things going on. It's a beautiful town, but along the way, certainly saw a lot of ways in which young women and girls were mistreated, and have my own personal lived experience that I later identified as sexual exploitation, but at the time kept my mouth shut because I was under what could have been true or misguided idea that if I told the police that they would take me from my parents, even though they had nothing to do with the situation. People didn't really know what human trafficking was, didn't have that label. And so fast forward 17, I'm going to Germany and got into this exchange program, and I was just escaping Texas life and signed up for an German class. And in there was a young lady who was a victim of labor exploitation and sexual abuse. And over time, we got to know each other, and we devised a plan that would have utterly failed, in which she was going to come back with me to the United States. And I was just going to announce at the border, so this is my friend, she's being exploited, she's going to live with me now, thanks. It wouldn't have worked, but she disappeared. And I ultimately tracked her background back to Bosnia, and went to Bosnia to look for her. And I never found my friend, but I ran smack into brothels and structural injustices and saw what was happening to girls there. And fast forward a few years after graduate school in Germany, I woke up shortly after 9/11 and was like, even if I only help one girl, I'm just going to see what happens. I have no background in running a nonprofit. I was 22 years old and just like out there. And from there, just dove into building a safe house years later, and consistently along the way, just seeing the injustices and the way that people often want to overlook what trafficking really is and where society is responsible. We look at the trafficker. We might even look at some of the online components to trafficking and sex trafficking in particular, this component. But we as a society have to look at ourselves, and that's where like I've landed is like, what am I contributing? And that's what drew me into this work. It's really I really feel blessed to be in this space.
Thank you, Andrea. I want to, before I go to Dr. Gopal, ask you, what is trafficking? Could you define that for our audience?
Yeah,
Because
of course.
they'll have their own ideas, but
Yeah. So I know this isn't visual, but I'm going to provide my own hand visuals for myself. So oftentimes trafficking, you have a trafficker or a group of traffickers, a triangle, and then you have the victim or victims, and then you have the consumer or the buyer, and that can be labor trafficking or sex trafficking. So within that triangle, you have force, fraud, or coercion. So the individual who's being trafficked, either for labor, like working as a nanny, working in a factory, working in a strawberry farm, which is something that happens in California quite a bit. So you have that, or you have the sexual component. And I urge the listener, don't think about the sex, think about the commerce. Think about the fact that whether it's a 14-year-old girl in Boston or a 16-year-old boy in LA, or a mom of three from Ukraine, it is force, fraud, or coercion. When you're talking about a child, so someone under 18, you don't have in the US, you don't have to prove that they were forced or tricked or threatened if it's sex trafficking, but you do if it's labor exploitation. So that's kind of a big, broad swath of it. I will add, and this is just my own add on here. This is not a legal component, but oftentimes people think about online sexual abuse as online sexual abuse, but there is a large component of that that's trafficking if it's commercial in nature. But commercial doesn't have to mean money. It can mean likes, brands, status, a pair of shoes. It can really be anything of value to the trafficker. So the Trafficking Victims Protection Act passed in the year 2000 codifies all of that, but we have a lot of work to do to make sure that we continue to push forward for people to understand what trafficking is and make sure victims get the care that they need.
thank you.
Beautifully said, Andrew. What a great explanation. Wonderful.
Thank you.
Dr. Gopal, I'll ask you sort of the same question. How did you get involved in work on sex trafficking education and prevention?
Well, honestly, so when I came to the US, right, I came to Vanderbilt University for my doctorate, and it's in Tennessee. And I was doing my doctorate there, and then I was posted for my practicum placement to a children's school. They call it the Severely Emotionally Disturbed program. So that's where I was posted. And I was there, and this young little girl who was like 7 years old, I was running group with all these kids and like a social emotional group. And she comes and sits on my lap after class and she says, my daddy touched me. And I'm sorry if it's a trigger to any one of your listeners so they can stop listening. And I should say that, of course, but honestly, if it's a trigger, I really don't want anyone to be listening. At this moment, they can come back in a few minutes. But she sat on my lap and she said, my daddy's touching me. And to me, that was shocking because I'm crazy with my dad. I adore my dad. And so I wasn't used to something like that. And so she wouldn't talk to anybody else except me. And so then I went through the whole process of CPS and so forth. And fast forward, a lot of kids started they started sending me a lot of kids with histories of child sexual abuse because for whatever reason, these kids were not opening up. They'd have the child advocacy centers, what we call the CACs. They weren't opening up there. And we have that in Indiana too and across the country. And so they would send them to me just to have me talk to these kids. And these kids would open up. So I started testifying in some pretty high profile cases after a while. They would fly down to Indiana or to Nashville. And I started testifying in these cases after my graduate education in Vanderbilt. So I started specializing in child sexual abuse, started seeing patients with child sexual abuse histories, and then even began my doctoral work on collecting data from little children, girls and boys, under the age of 3 for anatomically correct dolls. That didn't go through. I went all the way to the Attorney General in Illinois trying to collect the data. But what he told me was totally correct. I mean, if I had actually ended up collecting the data and found these interviews were tainted in any way, they'd have to throw out a lot of interviews. So I dropped that. I actually did two PhDs as a result of that. And my second one was a neuropsych, straight 4 months, schizophrenia, working memory, easy, done. But my practice then really picked up with cases of DCS, with the child sexual abuse. I became a DCS, or Department of Children's Services provider in Indiana, and a Department of Children and Family Services provider in Illinois. And I worked with a lot of cases, testified in a lot of cases, worked very closely with the judges. They really, really listened, which was absolutely wonderful. And then about 20, 30 years ago, I had a case of a family in Gary, Indiana, that was what we'd call sex trafficking today. In those days, we called it child sexual abuse. We finally got the family behind bars for 56 years. That was the first judgment in Indiana that was so powerful. And it's because the testimony is just heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking, and I won't go into details. And about 10, 15 years ago, and those days we didn't talk about sex trafficking. Andrea, you'd probably agree, but we didn't really discuss sex.
Yeah,
We said child sexual abuse is what we say, or, or date rape, or we'd call it all sorts of other things. And then so this young lady, this is my kind of aha moment, where this young lady who was maybe 15 years old in foster care, seeing a lot of foster kids and writing about foster care as well, published a few books on that. And then this young lady was at a payphone in Chicago, and here I am in Munster, Indiana. And she calls me and she says, Doc, come pick me up. And I said, look, honey, it's 9 o'clock at night, time for you to go back to your foster home. You shouldn't be out on the street. She says, Doc, come pick me up. And that haunts me because now when I look back, I think, what if, right? I don't know for a fact, but what if she's being trafficked and she's just begging me to come get her? So that segued me from from child sexual abuse, neglect, trauma, that whole thing, to human trafficking and sex trafficking. And then I started really asking questions because there's nothing in my training, in my clinical training, to know how to ask questions, nothing at all. And so I had to develop the whole protocol for clinical interviewing for sex trafficking victims. How do you interview them? How do you assess it? What are the telltale signs and all of that? And now I train medical doctors and physicians on it. And we have trained about 300 people in this past year, just across Northwest Indiana. But that brought me into the whole field of sex trafficking and working with victims of sex and labor, not only sex trafficking, but labor trafficking as well. And what we also call is adoption trafficking, is something I talk about a lot because we don't talk about it enough. There's a lot of trafficking where children as babies are taken into the adoptive care system, and then they're basically trafficked at that point. So there's a trafficking system, and there's a pipeline from foster care all the way to prison or homicide, right? So the girls tend to get killed. The boys commit suicide. There's this trajectory that they both go. And so how do you prevent our young girls from landing up in the jails? Because 1/3 of our jails are girls who've been sexually assaulted at some point in their lives. So what kind of treatment should we be giving those girls? And that's big for me. That's very big, the prison system. Because I think the way we deal with uh, what we call what is crime, even juvenile crime, is really, really problematic. But that's a whole different conversation. And so that brought me into the whole field of sex trafficking, developing protocols, developing treatment modules. We don't have any of that.
Let me ask you, because I've wondered this from a personal level. How would you potentially identify a victim of trafficking? I've been in bathrooms at airports where there's signs that say, if you see something, say something. And I don't know what I'm
I know what
supposed
I'm going to see.
what am
That's
I supposed to
exactly.
be looking for?
Oh
What
my
are you
God, that's
supposed to be
literally
looking
the
for?
training I do. That's like a 1 hour intensive training. How do you identify? Because patients come to us all the time. They'll come with depression, they'll come with anxiety, or you go to a restaurant, you see people sitting. You don't know. But there are subtle signs. For example, the eye contact with the person you're with, the way you sit with the person you're with, the way you stand next to the person you're with, the kind of demeanor you have. With our school kids, for example, the number of phones they have. Why do they have 4 phones? Why are they having a set of clothes that they take to school, but there's another set of clothes that they forget to change back into and come back home with? Why are kids who are 13 and 14-year-olds going for parties that are 17 and 18-year-olds, right? So there's a lot of grooming that's going on from high school to middle school to elementary school. And now with the internet, there's at least 400 different apps that we know of. It is absolutely mind-boggling how online exploitation has no boundaries at all.
Andrea, I know you know a lot about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the way sex trafficking, sexual exploitation is evolving into online spaces. And sometimes people ask me, like, why do you think traffickers are now online? I'm like, why are you online? It's convenient. And so they don't have some magical idea here. But the thing is, traffickers would traffic purple elephants if that made them money. The reason they're trafficking our children is because there's a demand. There is a demand for the online abuse content. I'm going to poke the bear for a minute, but with the Amber Heard Johnny Depp case in Virginia some years ago, there was over 1 million tweets about different things that people wanted to do to harm Amber Heard. Whatever you think about her and that case is irrelevant. The relevancy here of why I bring it up is we need a society in which 1 million people stand up and say, no, we don't treat women this way. We don't treat children this way. And, getting back to the justice system, we need a justice system that focuses on healing and protection and not just containment, and we see these high profile cases and we see, people walking and skirting away. And I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Believe Me. And part of what was the writing process was seeing how darn hard it was to get men who owned websites like Backpage.com or men like Jeffrey Epstein to be held accountable. And yet girls who are being trafficked and boys are being locked up on truancy charges, on prostitution charges, on very serious charges, which is what I wrote about in my book.
Yeah, the felonies, the
Yeah.
checks.
And the thing is, like, I think we're in an inflection point right now in society. And as I was sharing earlier with you, Asia, the technology piece, the online abuse is a mirror to what's happening in our society offline. And we have to decide, do we want to look in the mirror as a society and say that we've really, truly reached those most vulnerable? Or do we just want to wash over it and keep on going? And I think most people listening to this, probably by self-selection, are going to be the kind of people who want to dig in and get really, connected to this. As I was also sharing, when I first started to evolve from sex trafficking into online image abuse and sexual assault online, like deep fakes and sextortion, a couple of things came to mind as you were speaking, Dr. Gopal, is that girls who experience online sexual abuse, be it, again, deep fakes, sextortion, what some people call revenge porn, which is not a healthy term or accurate, but girls typically hang on for a period of time before they snap. I did a cursory review of 40 public cases of teenagers, mainly in the US, but globally, who had experienced image abuse and as a result committed suicide. And the girls all committed suicide within like 2 to 5 years in those cases. The boys within 24 hours.
Mm-hmm.
That was consistent across the board. And subsequent cases show that to be continuing to be the case. And so this is a public health crisis.
It really is.
And it's a national security issue because we have foreign actors, foreign websites reaching in to our digital walls in the United States and exploiting our children from their home, from the foster group home. And traffickers, people often talk about the perfect victim. The traffickers know who the perfect victim is. And it's that kid who's already been abused. It's that kid who's desperate for attention. And that's what our online environment is showing us. And it's not just kids. I am focusing on kids right now, but it is reaching into, women in political life, women celebrities, women in sports. It is really a vastly growing issue.
Absolutely. When you're talking and I was listening, boys try to commit suicide once and succeed. Girls try multiple times and eventually succeed, which is where you have that difference between 5 times versus once. And the other thing too is that while you were talking, I mean, what really made me start thinking is the fact that when we talk about demand, we don't talk enough about demand. People keep saying we need to end sex trafficking. We need to end. You can't end it unless you deal with the cause, right? The etiology. And the etiology, the cause is the way we raise our children. If a boy slaps a girl, what does the mother say? Oh, he probably likes you. You know, it's ridiculous. And boys are allowed to do a lot of things. Girls, you better not do this, you better not do this. There's so many, so the conditioning of girls versus the conditioning of boys is that they should sow their wild oats before they settle down. Whereas girls, if you do even once, you do something that's sexual, you're branded.
Oh yeah,
So,
for sure.
so yeah, so our the way we raise, the social, emotional, cultural, ethnographic way of raising our children is so damaging to them growing up that boys grow up suppressing their emotions and become lonelier and angrier. Girls become, unfortunately, we encourage girls, and they don't always do this, but we encourage girls to be more verbal and more dramatic and more drama queen, and then getting all that attention, because so we are treating our children in ways that are so psychologically damaging to them at a very young age. And they are buying into societal influences, right? You have now influencers on TikTok saying what ADHD is just completely wrong. You have people on TikTok saying what mental illness. I don't even, half my patients come here and say, where do you see it on TikTok? Like what? That's TikTok and Instagram are the source of scientific information, right? It is the most horrific situation. And so, yeah, like I've had boys come in who've tried to commit suicide, and that's why they come in. But really, some of them have come in because they try to commit suicide because of sextortion on Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat. So I think this conversation is so critical. And thank you, Andrea, for sort of bringing that whole online piece, because it's such a devastating issue at this point. It is what do I say? It's a pandemic. It's an epidemic for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
But you said you think we're at an inflection point. Tell me, do you both agree that we could be at a turning point? What does that look like? What are the challenges that remain? What got us here?
So I'm a storyteller in addition to everything else. If you don't mind, I'd love to it's a real story. It's not one I made up. So I also am the co-founder and pro bono executive director for a new nonprofit that has a very long name, the National Center for Internet Crimes and Cyber Exploitation. Sorry about that. We can call it NICFIC going forward. And what we do is we find cases through the FBI, through individual referrals, and we help victims of any age get their content down and create evidence packages so that they can pursue justice if they'd like to. Well, one of the cases that we got was connected to a perpetrator named Andrew Venegas. And this man in his early 20s from middle of nowhere, Texas, I can say this because I'm from Texas. In his early 20s, he started hacking into teenage girls' Snap accounts. He would get in, change their password, and then send a message to their phone pretending to be Snap saying, someone's hacked your account. We see some suspicious activity. Send us your PIN number. We'll fix it. So they're kids. So they do. Maybe not all of them did, but the ones that did, of which there were about 1,000, he would then go in, infiltrate, get all their photos, intimate or not, usually not. Snap has some protocols, and then also getting their friends and family, and he would package these in what he called blackmail packages, and he would sell them. 2,000 men that are known bought these children's blackmail packages. He made somewhere between $200,000 and $600,000 in an 18-month period.
Wow.
One of the young ladies that we are working with, when she was 14, she was one of those victims, going through a lot with her family. There's a lot going on, the pandemic. She starts getting these threats on all these different Instagram, Discord, her phone, her family, her friends are getting threatened. Do you think she tells her mom and dad? No, because she was told by Venegas that if she came forward, that she would be charged with child pornography. And she believed that to be true. And it might have actually been true, depending on some of the circumstances, unfortunately. So for 4 years, she suffered in silence until she went off to university. Things seemed to die down. And then the FBI comes knocking. Hey, we identified you in this huge case. And, meanwhile, while the abuse has stopped, the images are everywhere. And the same with another similar case that's been referred to as the Girls Do Porn case, which is the name of a website of which 500 women and girls were horribly exploited, of which 20 are no longer alive. The perpetrator is in jail, but the women are still struggling with their content and all over the world. And that's what we're up against and what we're fighting. But what sometimes I feel like when we get back to this point of inflection, there are rising advocates. There are laws that are being passed. There are people talking, but we're in the eye of a storm. You and I are old school, so we were in the eye of the storm and building the human trafficking movement when you have to have like strange conversations with it. Totally let my client, go to your shelter, and it's a rape for profit, so it's a sexual assault, so she can be in your shelter. Like, so you like negotiate all these terms, and now people, like you say, sex trafficking, and generally speaking, people have some idea or connection, whether it's true or not, is up for debate. But now when you're talking about image abuse, unless you really use terms like sextortion, people look at you like you have three eyeballs. And so you really, we're at a point now where I think there is an emerging movement, but we also, I have a hard time not thinking about those 2,000 men who bought these girls' content. In this one case, there's thousands of cases like this. Just this morning, I was talking to a young lady from a whole different part of the world. She's telling me what's happening to her. And I'm like, it's the European Andrew Venegas. And it's just, we can't let survivors stand the tallest in the face of their own injustice. We have to make this the inflection point and tip the scale.
Well, also, if you look at AI, right, and what AI is doing, you have Grok that unclothes people. And
Which
with
is one of
AI,
hundreds of tools that do that.
I know, right? But this is more socially acceptable kind of thing. And so we have AI where one of the issues that's happening right now, and the conversations as psychologists we're having with the Microsofts, the Anthropic. So we had the conversations are basically, because these are two major ones. Claude actually is, and I love this, Claude is actually not accepting sexually aversive, just aversive material, period. So there's this whole, they're training the AI tools, and psychologists are very involved with this, where we are getting on the same table with the AI folks and saying, hey, we have to have guardrails for AI because AI is that's the artificial intelligence creates its own artificial intelligence way of dealing with artificial intelligence that comes into it, right? The materials, because many of these materials are not real. You can make anything out of anything anymore, and you don't know what you're watching anymore because you don't know what you're watching is real. People like your next door neighbor could be saying something they never said. So you have to be really, how do you discern what's real versus not real? So even images could be created not by one person, but by AI. So who are you going to sue? Right? Where does that legal discussion go? And to what extent is technology liable if artificial intelligence takes its own path and decides on something without your input? So this is an inflection point for me from that angle, where we are looking at, so there's an interview done by Claude's co-founder, actually, and he was saying that, and this is very interesting because something he said really struck me. He said, we can decide to train AI to deselect aversive and non-altruistic data so that it then selects only the data that it feeds to people, which it feels is appropriate. So now AI is telling us what's right versus wrong. I mean, that itself is scary. Okay, but
Yeah.
what you get an evil AI or something, So it could be science fiction, but science fiction sometimes turns out to be not so fictional. And so then you have AI where we have no guardrails because you want to feed to those 2,000 men who are looking at those pictures and making you a ton of money by looking at those pictures. So there's who decides ethics, right? Who decides what's right versus what's wrong? In some cultures, a 14-year-old can get, as 8-year-old can consent to marriage. Okay. So what exactly are we looking at? What is it where a man can take a fourth wife or fifth wife who's not even old enough to recognize what the world is like, who's not mature enough, even at 15 or 16? So we have so many complex issues that are not only impacting sex trafficking, but across the board. But sex trafficking is particularly egregious because of the nature of sex trafficking. That's where it is. You're crossing some very intimate boundaries, human physical boundaries that, with other kinds of crimes, you don't necessarily cross those boundaries. So that's something that psychologists, and especially as a neuropsychologist, this really troubles me because you're dealing with cognitive input and you're dealing with cognitive manipulation and you're dealing with a whole generation of human beings who are being fed information that you want to feed them. Look at the change in the way they think about sexual matters. Look at the change in the way they think about crime and punishment. So you have this body of, now it's what, Gen Beta, right? So you have this body that's growing up with AI. So yeah, I am deeply concerned. And that's why this conversation is so critical. And I thank you, Asia, for this conversation, for starting this conversation. Yeah.
Let me ask, because I know that you have a starting point for us. How do we talk to Gen Beta? How do we talk to our kids about these issues? What can we do to set them on the right path to support them in a world full of mis and disinformation, sexual exploitation, and so on?
Yes. Okay. Me. Okay. Because I love listening to Andrea. So, well, I think what's really important is start young, start really, really, really young. The people who built AI don't let their children have cell phones. They send their kids to schools where there's no laptop. They learn. There's actually special schools for that. That's where these people are. If they're not sending their kids to schools like our kids are going to, if they're not giving cell phones to their little child, you know that they don't like what's coming out of those phones and the AI, right? So, and these are people who are the big names in AI. Where do you think the kids are going? Regular 18th century schools where they go and sit with books. So my concern is that there's legislation. That's my suggestion is that we need legislation that children under a certain age psychologically should not be on laptops, should not be taught on laptops. They should be taught old school education. There's some countries that have banned laptop education or computer generated education for kids that young. And there's reasoning behind that. The same reasoning that our AI founders have sent their kids to good schools. So we need to go back there. We also need to start a whole socio-emotional training about what does it mean to be a boy or a girl or a transgender. Transgender may be too young, but what does it mean to be boy parts or female parts? And what does that really mean? And say, how do you respect people, right? How do you respect people? How do you talk to one another? Forget gender. Just say, how do you talk to one another? How do you treat each other? And this whole conditioning, the social conditioning that I think Gen Z is being really good about it. I like the way Gen Z is handling social conditioning far better than my generation did. I can tell you for a fact. And so they are handling in a way that they'll dress the way they want to, they'll do what they want to, and they really don't care. And that's healthy, really healthy, because in some ways it takes away the pressure of body shaming and all that other stuff that, our generations had to have. So that's one route. The second route I think we need to follow is how we communicate with our own children at home. If you have a boy and a girl, are you treating them differently? So we need to walk the walk, right? We say a lot of good things, but do we really walk that walk? Do we really treat our kids differently? Do we really treat a boy differently than we treat a girl child? What are we communicating when we are in relationships with our better half? How are we relating to that person? How is that impacting the child who's watching you? The whole dominatrix, the whole that entire component that is now coming up and becoming normalized, right? So how are kids supposed to deal with all of that? And look at the exposure we give them to the internet. It's unfiltered exposure. And their brains are not yet mature enough to form that discriminative thinking process.
I so agree. My daughter just turned 12, and she's at this point now where, like, one minute she talks to me like a little kid. It's like, silly jokes and dolls. And the next minute she talks to me like a thrice divorced Manhattan attorney. It's just the cynicism's real, man. But, so she's in karate and she's close to getting her black belt, and she loves the discipline, the confidence. And one day we were recently walking down the street, and there was a fellow who was here in DC. He's like doing so, he looked very unwell, and I was a little edgy, like, uh-oh. She whispers to me, Mommy, I don't want to, but if it comes down to it, I can kick him.
Wow.
She's like, but
Wow.
I won't unless I have to. I was like, okay, I think we'll be fine. So you don't need to do that. So, but we're walking away, and I just realized she was aware and confident. And I love what you were saying about how we engage with our own kids or bonus kids if you have step kids or kids if you're a mentor. When I go out with my daughter, like, we don't do phones. She doesn't have a phone. She doesn't want a phone, but she is 12, so I presume this may change. But a lot of her little buddies have all of those, devices, and they're paying attention to, they're watching what you do.
Mhm.
So when we're out to dinner, I don't use my phone. And if I have to, I'll say like, honey, I need to make this call and I'm very sorry. It'll be this amount of time. And then I put my phone down. And I look around me, and this is no judgment because I'm a single parent, so it's real out there. But I see these other families where everybody's on their phone, the mom, the dad, the kids. And I'm like, how sad. You're not learning to socialize
Mhm.
or how to verbalize. AI can be an echo chamber. It's not going to disagree with you. It doesn't have any feelings. And so you're just talking to yourself and everybody else who's trained that AI. And so I trained my AI to talk to me like Jane Goodall, and mine says lovely things to me. But I trained my Instagram to show me pictures of bunnies. And so, but the reality is kids it's this loop, and you see boys are increasingly seeing this sexualized content.
Mhm.
There's an increase of
Mhm.
cases of girls who come into the hospital with strangulation marks because
Mhm.
the boys think that's what they're supposed to do.
Exactly.
And
The whole
girls think they need to
BDSM.
comply. It's like,
Mhm.
this is kind of getting old school here, but I'm like at that Gen Z, sorry, Gen X millennial cusp. So I'm a little old, but that term catty, like a woman's being catty. This one ex-boyfriend of mine made the mistake once of saying that to me. And I was like, listen, do you want to know what catty really is? It's that women and girls, when they've stood up for themselves
Mhm.
historically, get the shit beat out of them. I hope I can say that on a podcast. Okay, sorry. And guys can be like, "Ruh," and it's fine because it's boys be boys. But girls, if they're that verbal and that outspoken, like the chances of being a social outcast or hurt are high. So they've learned to transfer anger and those things in a different way. And so now you're seeing these manifestations of things that are online. And I know I've said it before on this podcast, but it's just a mirror of who we are. Like the internet is not some magical cowboy land. It is an infrastructure that is designed by people who know what they're doing. And I'm not anti-tech, but major tech companies are designing their products to be addictive to
Mhm.
children.
Absolutely. The
And
algorithms, yeah.
the trick is, I mean, I'm curious to see how the bans will work with kids. I mean, I have a feeling kids will circumvent these, but the real sweet spot and how we get there is a long way in the works, and it will probably never be done. But we kind of want kids to self-opt out of being online, not because they're scared. And again, my daughter a few years ago, I asked her, like, what do you think of Roblox? Even though I'm like, ugh, not wanting her to be online, not anti-Roblox, I just want her to be out and playing and living in life. And she's like, Mommy, I don't want to be online. That's where bad things happen to girls.
Good for her.
It is. And at the same time, and very self-aware, which she's very, very aware and probably reads way too much of my stuff. But at the same time, I wanted to opt out because it's just not where she wants to be. And that she doesn't, that it's not a fear-based decision. Because right now it's a fear-based decision.
Mhm.
And here's my little almost black belt in karate who will stand up to anybody on the street if she needs to. And then she sees the internet. She's like, Mommy, that's where the monsters are.
Yeah, I guess
And
this
this is
needs to
like,
be some sort
ugh,
of balance, right? Because the internet is great for research. I mean,
it's great.
I can, when I was in college, I was going to the library and poring over books and books and books and books. And now I just go into AI and say, pull out this research on XYZ, and I get it within like, what, 2 seconds, you know? So, and it's all good research, right? Not ChatGPT, but actual research sites. And it's really amazing. And I love it. And so there's so much out there that I can use and harness. But then they don't have that maturity in terms of age, right? To do that. So in a way, it's not too bad that she's seeing it this way, but over time she'll figure out what the sweet spot is, like you said.
Yeah,
She'll,
and I
she'll
think this
figure it out.
generation, she's a alpha, I think. This generation they're very it's different. Kids are seeing things differently, they're exposed to
Mhm.
things differently, and that's not all bad.
No.
Like my daughter knows what human trafficking is. But many of her classmates know what human trafficking is. I had an 8-year-old boy explained perfectly what sextortion was to me. I was like, oh, am I allowed to, where's your dad? So like, how do you know all this? He's like, school. He's like, but I feel
Yeah,
sorry for the young kids, the ones that get
me
caught up in
too.
these schemes. I'm like, you're 8.
I know
This
the
is,
8 going on 28, right? It's,
yeah.
they're really, yeah, I had a little kid, not a little kid, I had a teenager in I came late to your podcast because of that. I had this teenager I was finishing up with, and I was making sure he wasn't being trafficked because he was suspended from school from internet usage. And so, yeah, so but he was like, I know about human trafficking. I know about sex trafficking. I know all about all of that. We talk
Hmm.
about it too, so schools are addressing it, but I think more so kids are addressing it between themselves.
Mhm. It's interesting. I did not think that, one of the paths to addressing sex trafficking was going to be like get out and smell grass, like to get to know people around you, develop relationships, ask questions. Sex education is clearly important to addressing sex trafficking, talking honestly with your children. And what are some other final words that you have for those who are interested in sex trafficking prevention and education?
You got to start really with educating yourself and taking away judgment and understanding the root causes of foster care, homelessness, prior abuse. Everybody's talking about the Epstein files right now. Why do we need files when these women have been telling the truth for decades? We just don't want to listen. Most of those now women were girls in the foster care system, were girls who were being overlooked, were girls who were experiencing horrible exploitation. Virginia Giuffre wrote about it extensively in her recent memoir, which I think is a must read. It's a hard read, but I think it's a must read. And really seeing the signs and making that call to the human trafficking hotline and talking to your kids about it's not just movies getting old, but Taken with Liam Neeson, like that, just forget that movie
Yeah.
happened. Drop it with the Taken movie. But
Hmm.
think about like it's that kid who comes to school every day in the same clothes or who has multiple hotel keys in her purse, or has like all of their social media friends are like older guys. Well, that's weird because I love kids, but I don't Facebook friend them. I don't play Roblox with them. That's boring. In fact, I told a little girl I was mentoring, I was like, honey, I love you. But if an adult tries to play with you on Roblox, they're a weirdo because I have no desire to play Roblox with you, even though I love you. I find that
I agree.
extremely boring. And so, it's really like educating at the root cause and being willing to stand up to at-risk situations. So like as I mentioned in my book, I wrote about a young lady who was incarcerated or sentenced to 30 years. We were able to get her out in 10, but she was, on the streets. She was being exploited, a lot going on. And it was something that struck me is one of the detectives I tried to reach out to in her case. He was like, well, I always knew she was fast because she was out there giving blowjobs when she was 8. You didn't do your job, sir. Why wasn't she getting help? And people just give up or they say it's a bad girl or a runaway boy. And those are like the most at risk
Right.
kids and probably who you see in your clinic. And doctors play a big role. I have done a lot of training with the medical profession and just seeing some of the warning signs. Again, this young lady I'm mentioning in my book, she was stabbed in the leg and pregnant, and they took her to, she finally got to go to the hospital, and he stood there the whole time, and the doctor didn't ask her a single question. And had that doctor asked, are you okay? And why is this man triple your age lording over you? Maybe she would have been helped instead of being arrested. And arrest is not therapy. Like one point she said to me, well, at least I got off the streets. I was like, I hear you. And that's a valid experience. That being said, I would have preferred you being not in jail as a means to get you out of trafficking. There's the other path. And really every kid needs one adult that they trust. That's been my big takeaway is kids need someone who really deeply cares and invests. And it doesn't have to be big and fancy. It can just be checking in, being that obnoxious adult, like making sure they get to school and standing by them through and through. And that's just my big question when I meet a lot of my clients. It's like, where was everybody?
Yeah, I think that's a big question. Where was everybody, right? Because that's the one thing with all the shelter girls I have, all the ladies at the shelter. They're like, no one listened to me. And no one asked me these questions. And like she said, I mean, so correctly, why didn't the doctor even ask? Why is this big man much older than you? hovering over you? Just simple question like that. And the biggest issue I'd like your audience to really take away is that, yeah, we see something, say something, and like you said, well, what am I seeing? What am I looking for? The few signs that I really, really would like them to look for is fear,
Mm.
right? Fear. And fear is not easy to hide. And you can see that in literally every victim I worked with. There's this sense like, can I say this? Should I say this? Can I not say this? If I say this, something bad's going to happen. Can I talk to this person, not to this person? Multiple questions. Like you can see the thoughts just racing in their heads and always. And whether they can trust, because because they may take you away from your family and you don't want to leave your family. You don't want someone taking you from your family. You don't want them putting you in jail because you've just committed a few felonies because someone took you to the bank and made you forge a signature or forge somebody else's signature
Mm.
using their checks. That's big. You steal checks and then you take those checks and you pretend you're that person and you forge their signature because you learn how to copy their signature really, really well. And so if you are smart and you are trafficked, you're likely to be exploited that much more. So that's a huge thing. So don't go just because a kid is getting straight A's, don't think the kid is not being necessarily exploited. It crosses all strata, all socioeconomic strata, all academic strata, whether it's PhDs or somebody who's barely finished fourth grade. It doesn't matter. It crosses every judges. It crosses everywhere. And some of the judges who are victims themselves ended up becoming perpetrators because the girls tend. So the research has shown that boys who were trafficked can become the perpetrators. Women who are trafficked become the bottom girls and therefore the perpetrators in their own way. So they get used differently. So the females as much are traffickers as men are.
So
Just because you see an older woman with a little girl who doesn't look like her, who seems really scared, doesn't mean she's just a very strict mom. She
Oh
could actually
yeah.
be the trafficker.
I will end it here, but if folks want additional resources, we'll provide them below. I know both our guests today are published authors, and we'll link to their books as well. Any final words?
I just want to say that, the need for housing is really great. We are upscaling right now. We have a fundraiser on the 17th of March. We're calling it the Build Raiser. We are upscaling from a 6-bed home to a 40-bed campus. I don't like calling it a shelter. I just call it campus because then people can live together comfortably. And so we have the 40-bed campus, and we have to raise literally $750,000 to be able to give them everything they need. So we're having like a commercial grade kitchen. Our peer survivors, those who have graduated from our program, we're giving them suites upstairs from our meeting room so they can stay there. We're going to have childcare there. We're going to have very state-of-the-art education. So they'll be learning very creative ways of using their own brains. So they're not repeating the cycles that happened in previous generations. So there's a lot going on. So our first goal, our first round is raising a 250,000, 250,000. So I'm kind of focused on that. But I really think that anywhere in the country, wherever people are, if you have a residence nearby, a shelter, a safe house, contribute to them as a volunteer, donate food, donate clothes, do what you can, whichever city your listeners may be in.
I love that ending. I just had a woman who is a bartender in my neighborhood, and she is from the area. And she's like, "Can I donate clothes to your program?" And so she brought the clothes over to my place because she got off work late last night. And I'm opening it up, and it was like Christmas to me. I was like, "Yes!" Calling the nonprofit Fair Girls that I've founded and have been with for a very long time in different iterations. I was like, "Guess what I have?" And so.
Great.
And it's just and it was all clean and folded, which if you do donate clothes, please clean them first. Thank you.
Yes, please wash them first.
Please
Yes.
do. And if you only have one of the shoes of the pair, that's okay. Let it go. So we don't need those. But but really honestly is that it's toiletries.
Toiletries, paper towels,
Yeah, and like sweatpants and clean clothes and just
gas cards. Gas
yeah.
cards are very big for us. And repairing the tires, these girls, it's Indiana, we have snow and we have potholes, and our girls sometimes can't drive because the tires bust. So yeah, we always need support for all of that. Yeah.
Exactly. And I love your vision for the campus and not calling it a shelter. My first safe home was called the Vida home, and it was named
Love
after
it.
a young girl named Vida in Serbia who, had it existed in her life could have been very different. Reach out to your local shelters, your local programs. Here in DC, there's a lovely youth program called Sasha Bruce, and I've
Mm.
never worked there. I have no skin in the game. I just love them so much. So finding those places and investing in them and bringing your, because $10, $5, whatever you have is beautiful, but also so is things like food drives and or even cooking. At our safe home, we had volunteers who would come and cook with the girls, and it was about the food, but it was also about community,
Connecting. Yeah. Yeah.
connecting, and finding those beautiful moments. As dark as these issues are, I feel the most energized when I see people coming together and caring and giving.
And what I love is that they come back to us for Thanksgiving and Christmas. They bring their family with the children,
Oh
very
yeah.
cute because we reunite children with the parents too.
Oh,
So yeah, because they don't really look very good in court. They don't do a great job. So they end up losing the kids. And so, and really they should have kept the kids all along. So yeah, there's a lot of work needed, but I'm so grateful to you, Andrea, for being in this space because we need more voices like you.
same, and back at you, both of you, actually.
Thank you both for your time, expertise, and wisdom. I hope we can continue the conversation later.
Same.
Thank you for listening. That was Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. To learn more about how we use brain and behavioral science to empower human rights defenders, find us at mindbridgecenter.org and follow us on social media.